Welcome to section 15.1, where we start to discuss the topic of evolution. Now, when you talk about evolution, pretty much everybody comes back and starts discussing Charles Darwin. But ultimately, the idea of evolution itself, which just means change over time, goes back well beyond Charles Darwin. He's operating in the early to mid 1800s, but the idea of evolution really starts to creep in around the 1600s when we start to discover fossils of organisms that were definitely extinct. And this idea of extinction was new, and it didn't fit in well with what people thought, which was that some type of God put down organisms that would always be around. And the fact that there's extinctions means something appears to be off with this. So starting in the 1600s, people came up with other methods of trying to explain away these extinctions. But this has been a long time coming by the time Darwin comes along, where people had acknowledged the fact that there does appear to be this evolution, both in terms of the fossil record as well as more modern organisms, because breeding different types of dogs and breeding different types of livestock and crops had become a big deal. So we'd learned that we can manage to change the way things look and change the way they behave just by who they breed with. So this idea of evolution was rather entrenched by the time Darwin came along. Now the real big problem for Darwin was, why and how does evolution work? And that's why when you see a biologist talk about Darwin, it's not so much we're talking about the idea of evolution, we're talking about Darwin's contribution, which was the idea that evolution occurs via a process known as natural selection. So, if we're going to start with Darwin then, kind of ignoring some of the early stuff right now, let's discuss a bit about who Darwin was. So Darwin was an educated man, which was not the most common thing in the early 1800s. And so he decided to go along as a naturalist because he liked life and nature and he was educated. So he went along with a captain who was also an educated man and wanted some company with a bunch of perhaps not so greatly educated sailors for what was supposed to be about a 2-year trip on the HMS Beagle. And the ship was going to go around taking samples and ultimately being like a research vessel. And so it ended up being a 5-year trip. So this is kind of like Gilligan's Island stuff, where that 3-hour tour became a little bit longer. And along the way, they spent more than 3 years on land where Darwin could talk to the local populations, he could collect fossils, he collected live specimens, he made drawings of what he saw, and so he spent 5 years getting a ridiculous amount of data, specimens, and jotting down his notes, and then he pretty much spent the rest of his life looking through the stuff that he managed to collect during this 5-year extravaganza. So they left from Britain, and as they traveled pretty much around the world, they managed to hit lots of coastline areas, and they went aboard to kind of see what there was. They also hit several islands, you know, the famous Galapagos Islands, but they also hit other areas that were island areas as well. So he got an excellent sampling of islands, of mainlands from a variety of different continents, and so he was able to get a huge diversity of evidence and data as he went on this trip. Now, a lot of people like to point to just one part of this trip, and we'll use it just because it's convenient. But when Darwin was doing all of this work, he didn't just notice things at one location. It just so happens that for whatever reason, we see that the finches on the Galapagos Island is really stuck with people. They've resonated. And so we tend to refer to them. And so some of the things that Darwin noticed when he was on these trips is that the island species tended to be very, very similar to the nearby mainland species. And so this kind of struck a chord with him because the island environments were not necessarily that similar to the mainland environments. But yet it's still the same species. You know, there's finches on the mainland, there's finches on the island. And the finches on the island seem to bear a pretty close resemblance to the finches on the mainland. He noticed that when you look at groups of islands, you tend to see that on a group of island, you'll tend to have lots of different species, but similar. And so in other words, on the Galapagos Island, he saw lots and lots of species of finch. And many of these finches were doing things that finches on the mainland wouldn't necessarily do. You know, you might expect a blue jay or you might expect a sparrow to do this particular task. But instead, you don't see any sparrows or any blue jays. You just see lots and lots of finches. Or you see lots and lots of tortoises. Or you see lots and lots of particular types of animals on islands. And this can vary from groups of islands to groups of islands. If the islands themselves are far apart, you don't necessarily see the same species present. So maybe the Galapagos have finches, but maybe if you were to go look at a different group of islands completely in another spot, like the Hawaiian Islands, you might see not a single finch at all. But you might see a whole bunch of a different type of bird species. You might see, 20 different species of that particular type of sparrow or whatever. This is just theoretical. And so he noticed this, and it kind of stuck in his head. And then lastly, he noticed that the fossils he found in many cases appeared to be of extinct organisms, but they were very similar to living organisms. So he kept noticing that if he's in Australia, for instance, he sees kangaroos, but he also sees fossil kangaroos, many of which were larger, that was kind of a common theme, or just in general different than the current kangaroos. But it's not like he went there and he just found bear fossils or something, or wolf fossils. He saw kangaroos and he found kangaroo fossils. And so this kind of stuck with him, this consistency that he found as far as what's living there today and what appeared to have lived there prior but gone extinct. So now Darwin's sitting there trying to figure out, why is it that we see these similarities between past organisms and present? Why do I see these similarities amongst the organisms that live in a particular area, especially on islands? Why are there so many finches here? Why are there so many silver sword plants in Hawaii? There's like 40 or 50 species. It's crazy. Why do I see this clustering, this connectedness? And so Darwin had studied a lot of other people's work. So once again, he was not starting from scratch. And so he started to kind of process some of these other people's ideas. One of them would be Hutton. You might see them mention Lyell too. He's another guy that did similar work, where they'd been studying geographical formation. So they studied where do mountains come from? Why is it that we have some of the geographical changes that we do, the geological changes that we do? And they'd come up with this idea that the Earth is consistently and slowly changing geologically. So mountains erode, new mountains can form, and so the Earth is physically a changing place, and that the Earth is potentially an old place, because we'd had this idea for a long time that the Earth was probably thousands of years old, and now we started to have this idea that it's potentially millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of years old. At the time, they still favored more in the, low to mid millions, we'll say, versus what we now use, which is 4.6 billion. And so now we had this idea that there's consistent change going on in the environment, and there's a long time for change to occur, that it's an older Earth. And there was also people that had done studies looking at, well, if the environment is changing, could life change? And so you had people like Lamarck, who was a French scientist who was one of the first ones to really propose a why life might change idea. So he was the first one to try to come up with a theory for why or how evolution works. And so Lamarckism was that people could pass on acquired traits. And so his idea was giraffes would stretch their neck to reach the leaves that were higher up in the plants and the trees. And then as they did that, they passed on this stretched neck to their offspring. And then that offspring would stretch his neck a bit more. And they'd keep passing on these acquired characteristics from one generation to the next until eventually we got to have a giraffe that has a very long neck. Now, we know this isn't true. If this was true, you could dye yourself blue and have a Smurf baby. If this was true, you could learn calculus and your child would come out knowing calculus. So we know that acquired characteristics cannot be passed on, at least not in normal circumstances. There's a couple things you could dispute if you really get into gene expression and epigenetics, but in general, this isn't a thing. He also knew from artificial selection, which was creating new breeds of dog, which is a big thing at the time in the 1800s. New species of sheep and goats and cows. We knew that if we were to have humans, that's the artificial part, do the selection of which animals would breed by picking certain characteristics to be better, to be animals that are more able to breed than others because they have access to mates, because we make them have access, we specifically pair them up, that we could get wild changes. We could get dogs that got to be tiny, that got to be big, that got to have different fur types and fur colors. And so we could have these huge changes in relatively short periods of time. We're talking in some cases like 10, 20, 30 years. And we had these huge differences. And so this was kind of stewing in the back of Darwin's mind, that it appears as though that nature has a way for us to get major changes, at least if humans get involved. So now he's kind of thinking, is there some other way, is there some other better way that I could explain how we could get new species from the old species, where ultimately the species we have today are descended from the species that there were before that went extinct, at least in their older form. Because remember, the form can change now. So it's kind of like saying if you take those dogs that we're breeding, the bigger version of those dogs gradually die out, but because you're selecting them to be smaller and smaller, dogs themselves are still surviving. They're just now in their smaller format. They're now packaged in a smaller package. So if we were to look through the fossils, we would see that the bigger guys are now gone, but they're not gone like there's no more dogs. They just kind of gradually became these smaller dogs. And so this was ultimately in the back of his mind is, can I explain this, but can I explain how this would occur in nature without needing the intervention from people?